So I did my presentation on saturated fat and carbohydrates and how it directly relates to cardiovascular disease. So the introduction to this article basically states that carbs and saturated fats make LDL cholesterol levels get raised, which then causes an excess formation of adiposity, which is basically fat and that lines the arteries, arterial wall, and causes heart blockages and can cause diseases further down the line throughout someone's life. So the overall objective of this research experiment was to basically define the roles and impact of the consumption of saturated fat and carbohydrates and how they relate to different types of vascular. Some of the hypotheses that were mentioned were the risk of buildup and blockages in cardiovascular system reduces when the intake of carbs are reduced, and that is basically because one is less likely to be overweight, which is why there's less adipose being produced. There was also a hypothesis mentioned that said by lowering the consumption of saturated fat and replacing it with polyunsaturated fat, the risk of blockages also is reduced. So throughout this trial, there were different types of control groups for the dietary experiment. They had a group that replaced saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat. They reduced one of the group's saturated fat intakes and increased their carb intakes. There was also a group that was of postmenopausal women, and they were assigned to a low-fat intervention, but they were able to live in a free environment. There was also a Mediterranean-style diet that was enforced, which increased the intake of omega-3 fatty acids, which can be found in fish. They reduced the saturated fat intake, increased the fiber and carb intake. And finally, the last control group that they had was just people who did a whole lifestyle change. That would mean doing a vegetarian diet, a vegan diet, moderate exercise, stress management, and basically just transforming their whole life instead of just changing one nutrient intake. So the results from this experiment was actually very interesting. So throughout this, they did find that the cardiovascular health was benefited when you substituted the polyunsaturated fat for the saturated fat. There was also a lower risk of CVD when there was a limited carbohydrate intake, and this could be because there is less fat being produced throughout the body, which therefore causes less blockages throughout the arterial wall. The group that adopted the Mediterranean diet did show a massive decrease in heart disease and myocardial infarction risks due to the increase in fiber and the total fiber consumed. The carbohydrate level was at 72% reduction, which was huge and definitely was a huge factor in terms of reducing risks of heart disease. So the study was of all men besides the postmenopausal women group. There was 178 men, and they were assigned to one of those four groups that I had mentioned earlier. The diets were varying with the carbohydrate content and the low saturated fat content. The 26% carbohydrate group did show association with increases in large medium cholesterol LDL, but not with the small, as you could see on this chart right here. And these were compared relative to the diets with the lower saturated fat contents. Now looking at the women's group of the postmenopausal women, they were assigned to a low-fat intervention or comparison group in a free-living setting. So compared to a group that had no lifestyle changes, there was no differences between each group after a 6-year follow-up, but there was no increase of risk in terms of changing the diet of the postmenopausal women that were in the low-fat intervention. So for the conclusion of this research article, it did suggest that the polysaturated fat, if it is equal or around 9%, it is an acceptable replacement for the saturated fat and is found to reduce the risk of cardiovascular diseases. Also, with the changing aspects of CVD, scientists are reporting that obesity and insulin resistance are in association with the different forms of cardiovascular diseases. So how they can be lowered is basically just diet changing. If the saturated fat levels are not beyond 10% of your total energy consumption, the population may not benefit if to substitute for polysaturated fat. The high carb intake definitely has shown increase of excess adiposity, so being able to limit that will definitely help reduce your risk factors. So throughout this whole experiment, I did find that just changing your lifestyle, making sure you're not eating way too much of one nutrient, everything in moderation. There also may be more diets that show more benefited heart health over others, but overall, as long as your saturated fat levels stay around 10% of your total energy intake and your carb levels aren't ridiculously high, CVD can be avoided better than if you weren't paying attention to what you were consuming.